So welcome to this briefing on the 2020 Virtual Summit Interim Final Compliance Report produced by the G7 Research Group's Summit Studies team. My name is Madeline Koch, and I'm the Executive Director of the G7 Research Group. I'll be moderating the session today. So we are recording this and we'll broadcast it or post it on our website. We have asked everyone to mute, and so if you have any questions, we will ask you to unmute yourself so you have control. But I am not going to do any more talking. I'm going to hand it over to Gabby Regimbal, who will kick things off for us.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today to the G7 Research Group Summit Performance presentation. My name is Gabby Regimbal, and I am one of the incoming co-chairs of the G7 Research Group alongside Matthew Kiefer. Today, my colleagues and I will be presenting the results of the 2020 G7 Virtual Summit Final Compliance Report. The USA Virtual Summit was held on March 16, 2020, in response to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Initially, the event was scheduled to be in person in June of 2020, but was ultimately canceled for the remainder of the year, making it the first summit cycle since 1975 with no full-strength summit. Therefore, the final report assesses compliance for 20 priority commitments made at the March 2020 Virtual Summit based on members' actions from March 17, 2020 to May 6, 2021. Due to the circumstances surrounding the summit, many of the typical issue areas discussed at previous G7 summits were not addressed, and instead the response to COVID-19 was the central focus. Overall, compliance for the 20 commitments assessed was 95%, which is significantly higher than the previous 2019 Biarritz Summit final compliance score at only 79%. The European Union, Germany, and Italy all achieved the highest compliance ranking of any member, achieving a 98% compliance score, and Canada was determined to be the lowest scoring member with a 90% compliance score across all commitments. In terms of compliance by commitment, 16 of the 20 commitments assessed achieved a 100% compliance score. 10 of those 16 commitments were focused on health, 3 were focused on trade, 2 were focused on international cooperation, and 1 was focused on the global economy. The global economy commitment based on restoring growth, however, was the lowest compliance score with only 50%. This summit saw the highest average compliance compared to the previous 5 summits, which is reflective of the unique circumstances brought on by COVID-19. The 2019 Biarritz Summit saw an overall compliance score of 79%. The 2018 Charlevoix Summit saw an overall compliance score of 83%. The 2017 Taormina Summit saw an overall compliance score of 80%. And the 2016 Ise-Shima Summit saw an overall compliance score of 75%. The USA Virtual 2020 Summit was able to achieve such a higher score of compliance compared to previous years due to the unique circumstances of the summit itself, mainly in the form of the majority of commitments being focused around health during the pandemic, which made it more likely member states would achieve a higher score of compliance. There were 4 main topics assessed in our compliance assessment. These topics include health, international cooperation, the global economy, and trade. Commitments regarding health primarily focused on addressing issues arising due to the COVID-19 pandemic, such as coordinating research efforts, disseminating information about the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and strengthening health systems. Commitments regarding international cooperation were also pandemic-focused, centered primarily around the global response to the pandemic and cooperating on research and technology. The global economy commitment topic centered around economic recovery and growth to remedy the damage caused by the COVID-19 pandemic to the economy, as well as building confidence in economic systems. Finally, the trade commitment topic focused on facilitating international trade and improving international supply chains. I'm now going to introduce my team members who will talk more in depth about compliance for each specific commitment area. First, lead analyst Dorota Borofsky will discuss the G7 performance on health, followed by compliance director Ninar Falwal, who will discuss G7 performance on international cooperation. Lead analyst Malhar Moharir will then discuss G7 performance on global economy, followed by lead analyst and incoming co-chair Matthew Kiefer, who will discuss G7 trade performance. I will then provide a concluding statement. Finally, Madeline Koch will facilitate the question period. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation via the chat or use the raise hand feature at the end of the presentation. I will now pass it over to Dorota for the health topic.
Thank Thank you, Gabby. My name is Dorota Grofsky, and for this year, I have served as the lead analyst on the topic of health. Today, I'll be representing the G7's performance for health for the USA Virtual Summit Compliance Cycle. Health was first introduced in 1978 at the Bonn Summit, where the impact of drugs on human health was discussed. Since then, commitments regarding health have been made at almost every summit, but particularly since the year 2000. This was a very successful year in terms of health compliance. All commitments except for one commitment received 100% compliance. This is due to the urgency and immediacy of the COVID-19 virus and the overall need to curb the spread of virus and the pandemic. There were 11 subtopics under health this year, which span research efforts, public health measures, addressing the COVID-19 pandemic directly, and health collaboration between G7 members and other international organizations. As previously mentioned, all commitments had full compliance except for one commitment, and that was the commitment on health data sharing. The health data sharing commitment saw an average compliance score of 75% among members. 4 members had full compliance and 4 had partial compliance. For data sharing, G7 members committed to pool epidemiologic and other data to better understand and fight the virus, in which they had to A, pool epidemiologic data, and B, pool other data. Where G7 members were expected to pool the data related to policy, best practices, and so on, in order to achieve full compliance. G7 members did well to share epidemiologic data, however, they struggled to meet the second portion of the commitment, requiring them to pool other types of data as well. Compliance was very strong in other topics as well, so the general trend this year is that member states were highly compliant to their commitments made at the 2020 summit. The G7 members with the highest compliance scores were Germany, Italy, the United States, and the European Union, as they had full compliance within every health commitment. When it comes to lower scores, it was Canada, France, Japan, and the United Kingdom, which while they had very high compliance overall, these were the members which had only partial compliance in the data sharing commitment. Member compliance for health commitment is very similar to member compliance on other topics in the final report, as members overall had very high compliance in areas other than health. Compliance for health was very strong prior to the final report, with G7 members receiving the same scores in the interim report as in the final report, both of which can be found on the G7 Information Center website. Overall, the health compliance results are a substantial improvement over last year's BOIT's health compliance results. There were only 3 topics discussed at last year's summit, and the compliance scores for those 3 topics were 44%, 100%, and 56%. For primary healthcare, universal health coverage, and mental health, respectively. The compliance score of 44% for primary healthcare was the lowest of all commitment features in the BOIT's report. In 2018, for the Charlotte-Bois cycle, there was only 1 health commitment on the topic of mental health, and there was 75% compliance. In 2017, for the Taormina compliance cycle, there's also only 1 health commitment on the topic of mental health, and there was only 25% compliance that year. In 2016, for the Ise-Shima compliance cycle, there were 2 health commitments on the Global Fund and Global Health Security Agenda, with a compliance of 88% and 69% respectively. And in 2015, for the LMAO compliance cycle, there were 3 health commitments: coordinated rapid development, national action plan, and vaccines, with compliance scores of 88%, 88%, and 81% respectively. Thus, there are no clear trends from year to year regarding health compliance. However, this year's compliance was at its highest and also had the highest number of commitments under the topic of health. I will now pass it on to my colleague, Ninar Fawal, on the topic of international cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorota. Hello, everybody. My name is Ninar Fawal, and I've served as a compliance director for the G7 Research Group this past year. And today I'll be representing the G7's performance in the international cooperation topic for the 2020-2021 US cycle. So most G7 summits in the past have incorporated some sort of reference to international cooperation in their commitments, but the topic of international cooperation in regard to health per se was first introduced in the 2000 Okinawa summit in light of the spread of infectious diseases like HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. The summit also created the Infectious Diseases Initiative, which supported international cooperation for conducting research on infectious diseases. So international cooperation in response to the COVID-19 pandemic was particularly emphasized in the 2020 G7 Virtual Summit, and this has been met by quite a strong performance by G7 members. The report assessed a total of 2 commitments pertaining to international cooperation. The first commitment states that G7 members are committed to doing whatever is necessary to ensure a strong global response through closer cooperation and enhanced coordination of our efforts. So we've understood it to mean that G7 members will undertake joint state action through cooperation and/or coordination in public health policies to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. We've outlined 2 main methods in which the G7 member can demonstrate compliance to the commitment. So first, the G7 member can improve other countries' or regions' responses to COVID-19 through actions like, for example, distributing COVID-19 diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, and other pandemic resources to other countries. Or, for example, supporting healthcare expansions in other countries to combat the disease. The second method entails that the G7 member improves international flows or processes among countries in their reaction to the pandemic, including through, for example, removing trade restrictions and establishing international agreements on the allocation of vaccines. So this was the first commitment on international cooperation. The second commitment states that G7 members are committed to marshaling the full power of our governments to encourage science, research, and technology cooperation. For compliance, we've determined that the G7 member must take strong action on either science, research, or technology cooperation, or altogether, while at the same time encouraging other members to act. Strong action largely means funding towards any or all of the target areas. Both commitments received 100% or perfect compliance as measured by our compliance standards. All G7 members for both commitments received 100% score of full compliance. This falls in line with the general trend of compliance in the report, which was unusually high due to the urgency of the pandemic and its consequences, as explained before. And overall, G7 members stressed the importance of international cooperation among states, international organizations, and also the private sector in tackling COVID-19, which is why compliance with the topic and its commitments were so high. And as previously mentioned, all members demonstrated a strong compliance with the topic and its commitments, and have all generally had a similar level of performance in terms of strength and relevance of their actions. Measuring by number of actions for the first commitment, Italy has had the highest performance and the EU has had the lowest. And for the second commitment, the US has had the highest performance and the UK the lowest. But I want to stress that this conclusion is purely according to the number of actions taken, in which a lesser number of actions means a lower performance and a higher number means a higher performance. There was an improvement in the US's compliance with the first commitment to ensure a strong global response to COVID-19. In the interim report for this cycle, the US scored a 50% for partial compliance, which then rose to full compliance by the final report. There was also an improvement in Italy's compliance with the second commitment of encouraging science, research, and technology cooperation, where Italy also scored a 50% for partial compliance in the interim report, but then scored 100% of full compliance on the final report. So both commitments saw an improvement in their scores between the interim and the final report, and in both cases, the average increased from 94% compliance to 100%. So this cycle generally represents a significant improvement in compliance from previous summits that included some aspect of international cooperation as a commitment. For example, the 2016 Iseshima Summit included a commitment of international cooperation on crime and corruption, and also a commitment of international cooperation on terrorism, which received an 81% and 75% compliance score respectively. So as you can see, compliance in relation to international cooperation went up significantly since then. So overall, this topic and its commitment saw excellent performance and compliance from G7 members. And I will now be passing it on to Malhar for global economy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ninar. So hello, my name is Malhar Mohabir, and I served as a lead analyst for the 2020-2021 year. And today I will be representing the G7's performance in the global economy topic for the 2020-2021 US cycle. So the economy has been a main topic of discussion since the very first G7 summit in 1975, with more than half of that summit's conclusions concerning economic policy. And over the years, we've seen more fragmentation and division of the economy at summit meetings into various subtopics, and commitment areas have emerged that often individually address different aspects of the global economic environment, including macroeconomic policy, digitalization, labor and employment, and inclusive growth, just to name a few. And so this year, because of COVID-19, the global economy commitments have focused on the economic shocks associated with the pandemic. And as such, it's really the first year that we've used the umbrella term of global economy. But nevertheless, commitments made that fall under this section do incorporate many of the prior commitments that the G7 members have made at past summit meetings. And what was quite interesting to see is that the commitments made this year were not only about responding to the economic shocks and reestablishing the pre-pandemic status quo, but using the summit as an opportunity to address broader issues, including income inequality, job loss, and digitalization that were pervasive issues well before the pandemic. So in total, there were 4 global economy commitments assessed, which could be broadly categorized into 3 core areas. The first is restoring economic confidence and growth through monetary, fiscal, and structural policy. The second is risk aversion, so establishing and maintaining stronger institutions to prevent widespread economic loss in the future. And the third is essentially accelerating growth beyond the pandemic, beyond pre-pandemic rates through economic inclusion and investments in clean energy and infrastructure. So with that being said, in total, we assessed a compliance score of about 78% for all G7 members and the European Union across all 4 commitments. So the highest scoring commitment concerned safeguarding against downside risks. So specifically looking at countries taking strong action to strengthen the economic security and resilience of small businesses and families. And we found 100% compliance from all G7 members there. And the lowest scoring commitment in the global economy area concerned post-pandemic recovery. So specifically, leaders pledged to not only restore the level of growth anticipated before the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the first part of that commitment was observing whether members managed to actually reattain their pre-pandemic economic growth rates as outlined in the International Monetary Fund's World Economic Outlook in January of 2020. Unfortunately, no member managed to return to these growth rates during the compliance period. However, I would like to point out that according to OECD data, the United States is expected to reach pre-pandemic growth rates by the end of June, so slightly past this year's compliance period. Japan is expected to make its recovery by September, with the rest of the G7 members, including the EU as a whole, expected to make their recoveries somewhere between the end of 2021 and into 2022. And so the second part of that commitment itself was itself divided into 2 parts. The first part was economic inclusion, specifically related to women, youth, and the elderly. And the second part was investing in clean technology and infrastructure in alignment of the G7 members' climate change commitments. And so within that specific part of that commitment, we found that Germany, Italy, and the United States demonstrated the strongest actions towards addressing these areas, but overall, all members could have contributed more towards facilitating greater long-term measures to address inclusive and green growth. So the overall compliance score received for this cycle was 94%, and the score in the global economy area falls well below that with a score of 78%. And so we have 2 main predictions as to why that was the case. So for one, as health was the overwhelmingly prevalent issue, it appears as though most countries remain focused on those responses and those commitments. And additionally, when we were assessing the economic response of the G7 members, we noticed that much of it was on short-term immediate solutions, such as stimulus checks and unemployment insurance, for example, which were no doubt important, but our focus for this year's compliance reports was more on long-term solutions and initiatives for spurring post-pandemic growth. So members with the highest performance include France, Germany, and the European Union, who fully complied with 3 of the 4 commitments in the area. Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States each fully complied with 2 of the 4 commitments in that area. In regards to lowest compliance, Canada fully complied with 1 of the commitments in the area, with partial compliance in all 3 other areas. However, it should also be noted that no G7 member received a negative score for compliance, which was an encouraging and pretty welcome sign to see. And so noting that the average compliance with all their commitments this year was about 94%, France, Germany, and the EU's commitments to global economy scored at 90%. Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US's commitments each scored at 75%, and Canada's at approximately 63%. So between the interim report and the final report, there is an opportunity for change in compliance scores. So Germany and Italy both improved their compliance scores from their interim report, with Germany improving their compliance from partial to full with the downside risk commitment, and Italy improving from negative compliance to partial compliance and the economic growth through coordinated policy actions commitment. And so while there was no specific global economy commitment as such last year at the Biarritz Summit, the commitments made toward the digital economy sector, including reducing digital and economic inequalities, as well as commitments in the entrepreneurship and economic gender inequality section, averaged to about 79% compliance. So this year's global economy compliance is slightly lower than the compliance for similar areas from last year's summit. And for the 2019 Biarritz cycle, there were 3 commitments assessed for economy: digitalization, entrepreneurship, and gender economic inequalities. Digitalization received a score of 75%, entrepreneurship 81%, and gender economic inequalities 81% as well. For the 2018 Charlevoix cycle, 4 commitments were assessed. Firstly, inclusive growth, which received 100% compliance. Secondly, labor and employment, which also received 100% compliance. Thirdly, development finance with a compliance score of 75%. And lastly, gender equality in labor markets receiving a score of 100%. For the 2017 Taormina cycle, 2 commitments were assessed: macroeconomics and inclusive growth with a combined score of 81%, and labor and employment with a score of 75%. For the 2016 Ise-Shima Summit, the Macroeconomics Economic Initiative was assessed and received a compliance score of 63%. And finally, for the 2015 ELMAO Summit, 3 economy commitments were assessed. Firstly, the macroeconomic policy fostering growth commitment, which received a score of 94%. Secondly, the macroeconomic policy fiscal flexibility commitment, which received a compliance score of 88%. And lastly, the infrastructure commitment, where compliance equaled 88%. And so overall, the average compliance for global economy commitments over the last 5 years has been 85%. So now I will invite Matthew to discuss trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Malhar. My name is Matthew Kiefer, and I serve as a lead analyst for the 2020 USA Virtual Summit Cycle, and I'm also an incoming co-chair for the G7 Research Group alongside Gabby Regenball. Trade has been addressed in every G7 document at every summit since the G7's inception. G7 members have consistently supported free, fair, and open trade. Over the years, G7 priorities have shifted, most recently landing on WTO reform as a priority trade issue. To date, G7 members have made 345 trade commitments, of which the G7 Research Group has assessed 45 for compliance. The average compliance for all 45 assessed commitments is 65%, which is well below the overall average compliance score of 76%. Trade, like the other issue areas assessed in the 2020 G7 Virtual Summit Compliance Report, has seen a spike in compliance performance. For the 2020 G7 Virtual Summit, the G7 Research Group assessed 3 trade-related areas: supporting trade and investment, addressing international supply chains, and facilitating international trade. All three of these trade commitments have scored 100% compliance, which is 5% than this year's compliance average of 95%. This means that every single G7 member scored 100% compliance in all three commitment areas. In comparison to the 2019 Biarritz G7 compliance report, the overall performance for trade has increased exponentially. The 2019 compliance report assessed two trade commitments: WTO reform, which achieved only 63% compliance, and tax policy reform at 75% compliance. By G7 member, the European Union leads overall trade compliance with an average compliance score of 83%, followed by Canada at 76%. The lowest scoring G7 members for overall trade compliance are the US with 59% overall compliance and France at 48% compliance. I will now pass it over to Gabby for the concluding remarks.
Thank you, Matthew. With that, that is the end of our presentation phase, and we are now entering into our question period. I would like to thank each of my colleagues for their wonderful comments and their expertise. As my colleagues have highlighted, this cycle had remarkably high compliance across the board, with 16 of the 20 commitments assessed receiving 100% compliance. Our final compliance report is now available at g7.utoronto.ca, and the G7 UK Cornwall Summit background book is available as well. We will be distributing the link via the chat, so please give it a look. We will now be opening the floor up to questions. Questions can be posted in the chat, and Madeline will direct them to the relevant panel member. Thank you again, and please present us with any questions you have.
Thank you very much, everyone. I see that John Curtin has a question to ask, but I would actually like to jump off first by asking any of you a question, but perhaps maybe as the incoming chairs, Gabby and Matthew might be best positioned to answer this. Can you please explain a bit how you go about making these compliance assessments and what you mean by the compliance period?
I can start with this one. Okay, awesome. So I'll start with the second part of your question. The compliance period runs from the when the virtual summit was held, which was in March, and goes all the way up until when we assess goes all the way up until this upcoming summit, or when we do our last scan of government sites for commitments related to the issue areas. And the first part of your question was how
do you go about making the assessments? Where do you get the information you base your assessments on?
Absolutely, and that's a really great question and important to touch on. We have a team of analysts, and they will each look at government websites first and foremost, and international organizations as the primary source of where we get our information. And then we also do a scan of relevant news news sources, and again, this is all country specific, and from those we that's where we get most of our commitments from. Yeah.
Thanks. I believe Professor Curtin, the director of the G7 Research Group, has a question.
Thank you, Madeline. Merci. I have a simple question. It is why? Why, for the first time in G7 summit history, dating all the way back to 1975, do we have virtually complete, almost perfect compliance, and compliance far higher than any other summit before? I have a short list of causal candidates, suspects. Let me go through just a few at the top of my list. The first, the President of the United States, and Gabby, perhaps you might like to comment on this, because I believe you're the member of the presentational team who lives closest to the White House, where US presidents live and work. I recall, correct me, that much of this virtually complete compliance, the interim compliance report shows, actually came while Donald Trump was largely the President of the United States. And of course, it was he who had chaired the March 16th summit where these commitments were made. So is it the exceptional, unprecedented will and skill of Donald Trump and his commitment to international cooperation through the G7 and his ability to get all his government and Congress to comply on behalf of the United States with the commitment? Gabby, that's my first candidate. May I just go through the second and third at least? The second possibility, and the member of the presentation team who most knows about health might wish to comment. The summit, the commitments overwhelmingly, they were about COVID, which is an unprecedented shock in so many ways. My label for that cause, it's number one in my mental world, shock activated vulnerability. So unprecedented shock and vulnerability for G7 members, unprecedented compliance. But candidate number three, and I think this probably should go to Matthew, who I believe is located geographically closest to Japan, although I see Mary No is listening in and may claim the first spot there. Japan, the G7 member since March 16th, with by far the fewest number of citizens dying at home of any G7 country, even today. So Japan, vastly less shocked and vulnerable, but it has exceptionally high compliance too. So Matthew, is there something very, very special about Japan? Maybe it only takes a tiny little shock to be really scared, far smaller than the other members do. Or could it be that the commitments from the summit itself were so unambitious that it was almost automatically easy for every G7 member to comply to such a high degree?
I guess I'll start since you directed the first question at me. Just to clarify, the question that you're asking is whether the success of overall summer performance, specifically for the United States, is the result of Donald Trump's international expertise or I guess another factor. And to answer that question, no, it is definitely not the result of Donald Trump's international cooperation or his passion for cooperation globally. It really just has to do with the unprecedented nature of the summit, the fact that it was virtual because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that 11 out of the 20 commitments assessed were all health focused. So if you actually look at compliance overall for the United States, they achieved 93% compliance. But if you look at the previous summit year, which was 2019 Biarritz summit cycle, they only achieved a overall compliance score of 64%. So because many of the commitments this year were health focused, and as a result, because of the pandemic, much easier to achieve, that is why they achieved a higher rate of compliance versus past years, not because of any global cooperation initiatives.
Nina, did you want to address, or sorry, Dorota, you were doing health. Did you want to address any of the questions that Professor Curtin raised about that subject?
Sure, I can just briefly mention. COVID-19, the disease, and SARS-CoV-2 virus, as a novel and emerging virus, I believe the uncertainty, particularly in the early months surrounding the virus and the unknown nature of its pathologies and potentially the scale of damage which it could cause to human life as well as to sort of societal interactions was really unknown. And I think each G7 member had its own sort of personal internal motivations to address the virus, not as much as a desire to potentially collaborate globally, although it is becoming an increasingly science and international health collaboration is becoming increasingly standard, and organizations, universities, and governments are continuing to work together to share resources. So I think it's the outcome of not only the urgency and immediacy of the pandemic and the virus that caused it, but it's also, I think, a more ongoing trend in healthcare and in science and research in general that is motivating these organizations to work together globally, because they're seeing the value that can come of this international collaboration that happens. I think, we haven't had a pandemic of this scale in over 100 years. And I think that kind of not only fear, but also uncertainty is really what was motivating the G7 members to really put their best foot forward, invest a lot of money, particularly in health, and really just trying to avoid causing any more damage through their policies and actions than the virus itself could cause. So I think these are the reasons why the virus itself is kind of what pushed countries into action. However, it's in response to platforms which already exist in the world of healthcare and science and research, which actually enabled these countries to cooperate in such an effective manner. And I believe that's really why compliance was so high, particularly in the sphere of healthcare.
Ninar, we were looking at international cooperation, and that was a theme running throughout Dorota's comments just now. Do you have anything you would like to add in response to Professor Critton's question?
Yeah, so I think, regardless of domestic factors in terms of the Biden administration versus the Trump administration, I think the extraordinary compliance and unprecedented compliance of this year's cycle was largely due to the pandemic and its far-reaching consequences. But I do see the value of Biden coming in as US president. I understand that they're concerned by democratic backsliding in some parts of the world, as well as China. So I think I'm expecting for this summit to be a reinvigorated, the theme of democracy, especially with the guests that they've invited. And I think given that we're still in the pandemic, the unprecedented compliance will continue. But I do largely think it's because of the pandemic itself and its impact on health, the economy, security, so many other factors that they recognize the urgency of it more so than the introduction of a new Japanese prime minister or the introduction of the Biden administration. But those are my thoughts, and anyone, if they have differing opinions, I'd like to hear them as well.
Malhar, did you have anything you'd like to contribute? You need to unmute.
Sorry about that. My camera just fell. But yeah, I think there is just something to say about sort of the economic environment. And as I mentioned earlier, the economy was like the lowest area of compliance out of all 4 sections. And I think essentially there's sort of 2 parts to that. First of all, I think that the economic commitments that were made during the pandemic were quite ambitious. And I think the actual implementation of them was pretty constrained by the realities of the pandemic. So economic projections are always fraught with uncertainty, especially during a time of emergency. And I think that it's entirely possible that some of the commitments that they made, particularly the promise to not only restore growth, which we interpreted in our compliance report as attaining pre-pandemic growth rates, just simply could not be met during such a short time period. However, I also did mention earlier that countries are definitely catching up. The United States is expected to return to its levels by June, and several other countries are making lots of good headway in the economic sector. So I think just because there wasn't as much compliance within that economy section. I think there's still a lot of progress that's been made. And I think the second part to that question, specifically related with the economy, is that a lot of the focus for recovery has been on the short term. So ensuring that companies, businesses, and families are well supported during this time. And that's really kept the current global economic and financial system relatively stable over the past year or so, to, I think, the surprise of many. But I think at the same time, that it also has appeared to take away somewhat from the longer term issues that have preceded the pandemic. And so while members did pledge their commitments, there's still some work to be done towards ensuring that things like clean energy and infrastructure, inclusive growth for women, families, youth, businesses, and et cetera, are adequately addressed for the long run as well. And I think that's going to be a focus for this year's summit and this year's compliance period as well.
Matthew, as our representative from the West Coast, did you want to respond to the professor's question? I'm not sure if you've been following Japan in particular, but.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start by saying, having lived in Japan for a year, it is a very special place. And aside from their excellent culture and food and beautiful temples, there is a culture of mask wearing even prior to COVID-19. And I think that certainly plays a factor. But I also think a bigger factor is something that each of my colleagues has already touched on, which is the very uniting response to COVID-19 that's brought about by its severity, the health risks. A crisis of this international scale requires an appropriate international response, and that's exactly what we have seen. And I think Japan is a really interesting case that will require a lot more research in the coming years, given that their vaccination rate has remained significantly lower than many G7 members, yet they have performed remarkably well as far as death rates and infection rates in spite of that. So it is a very interesting case and something that I don't think we fully have the answer to, but it will certainly be interesting to see. So yes, Japan is special, but also the other factors that Dorota and Gabby and Ninar have touched on are very significant as well in their success.
I see a question from Mary No, who is actually based in Asia at the moment. Perhaps you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the question directly, or would you prefer that I read it out for you? Mary has asked that we read it out. Mary is currently in Seoul in Korea. And Seoul is an interesting place to be at the moment because although Korea is not a member of the G7, it is a member, of course, of the G20. And Korea is one of the 4 countries that have been invited to participate in this year's summit, although, of course, was not participating in the virtual summit last year. Mary's question is, do you think that the G7 members' exceptionally high compliance and health this past cycle might indicate that future cycles will continually and consistently show high compliance in health, or will further prioritize health? Or do you think that the high health compliance from the 2020 summit will be singular because of the context of the COVID-19 pandemic? I'm not sure. We can start with Dorota, of course, because health was your issue, but others of you may want to contribute because, of course, this question touches on all of the issues on the G7 agenda and not just health.
All right, I can start. Thank you for your question, Mary. I believe, at least for the next few years, health will continue to be a priority for the G7 members. And I believe that that's because we've come to a realization that these pandemics are possibly going to happen again. They might be with different pathogens, but I think we've realized that our impact on the environment continues to change sort of the dynamics between humans and the animals, which can transmit these highly pathogenic viruses and bacteria. So I think that this pandemic has raised this awareness regarding the fact that we need to continue to plan and prepare for pandemics in the future. You know, investing in more research, investing in preparedness in terms of how do we have vaccines ready to be rolled out at a moment's notice. So this is really something that I think will continue to be on the minds of G7 members. However, in the past year, there has been a remarkable lack of emphasis on other non-communicable diseases, for example, cancer, heart and stroke health, diabetes, etc. And so this is something, while it took a backseat to the COVID-19 pandemic, I think these issues will start to arise once again in the minds of our G7 members. However, it's difficult to manage that balance between both non-communicable and communicable diseases. So I think that might kind of take away some of the emphasis in the future on health, you know, as we kind of return to more steady state and other issues can kind of come to light. However, it's my hope at least that health will continue to be a priority for our G7 members, although it might kind of take a different approach. It might not be, you know, preparing, you know, how do we have masks and what are our public health measures in place, but it might be something different. It might be more along the lines of those non-communicable diseases or pandemic preparedness. So hopefully things continue to go positively and we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic and learn to be ready for anything else that might come our way in the future. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to add any comments about whether they think this trend will continue?
I can jump in and I just want to point out that Prime Minister Boris Johnson actually unveiled a 5-point plan to prevent future pandemics and global health crises. So I think this pandemic really prompted G7 members to take a much more proactive stance towards health in general, especially in funding healthcare systems, in having initiatives like COVAX, which really emphasize equitable distribution of vaccines and other treatments. So I think that this pandemic was a sort of trigger that, really emphasized long-term planning as opposed to more reactive planning and responsive planning. So I am optimistic because we still are very much in the midst of a pandemic. And even if, as we understand, G7 members are moving past it, it is a global pandemic at the end. So if other countries like India, for example, are really struggling with COVID, then that means that it's still an ongoing issue and response is ongoing and more dynamic than we think. So I think it's going to be much more proactive and preventative in the future and hopefully still have high compliance. Thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else?
I can add something.
Yep.
Just relating to, I guess, my piece with the economy. So usually we see some sort of development commitments arise with, as one of the 20 that we assess, and specifically within the global economy commitment, it was definitely more of a focus on domestic issues this time around. So spurring domestic growth, that's sort of what we interpret it as, and that's sort of the actions that our analysts found as well. It was mostly domestic. So I think that especially with this year and this year's commitment compliance cycle, that there's more of an interconnectedness. I think that would be great to see between sort of the health aspect as well as the development aspect, and ensuring that those two sort of go hand in hand as well. Not only ensuring that countries are adequately supported in terms of public health measures, but ensuring that they're economically and financially supported as well throughout however long this pandemic is going to last.
Thanks. Gabby, Matthew, any other comments?
Yeah, I guess just briefly, I will say, kind of reiterating what Ninar has touched on, that it certainly seems that for the summit this weekend, health will remain a cornerstone of the communique and what the leaders discuss. And so I certainly think in the 2021 cycle, we will see a very similar focus on health, specifically pertinent to the COVID-19 pandemic that again continues in many countries and will continue for a time to come. However, I don't think that perhaps in the long term we will see such a focus on healthcare. I think other issues such as climate change, such as economic recovery, may begin to take to kind of reshift the balance. And yeah, but certainly for the next for certainly this summit this weekend and perhaps next year as well, I think there will still be a preeminence on health specifically related to COVID-19.
Gabby, last word to you.
Yeah, I completely agree with Matthew. I think this year we're definitely going to see an emphasis on vaccinations and future pandemic preparedness. But 10 years down the line, you know, public memory is quite short. And as other issues begin to take center stage, I think health will again kind of go on the back burner. As we've seen, and Dorota mentioned in her presentation, especially mental health has never had very high compliance. And I don't see it really getting the recognition that it deserves, especially as we've seen during the pandemic, and mental health services were very were not provided to the level that they needed to be. So I think that especially climate change, as Matthew mentioned, becomes more of an issue, especially as we see the extreme weather and disasters emanating from it, that will become the biggest topic.
Thanks. Great. Well, we've reached the end of the briefing, so I'm just going to wrap it up. I think I will just make one small comment, which is that Matthew mentioned climate change. That was an issue that was, of course, not really on the agenda of the virtual summit last year, but is a really significant issue that's occupying a lot of space politically, mentally, in terms of international cooperation and generally. And so I think we will see more of that coming into the Cornwall Summit, especially as the UK is co-hosting with G20 host Italy, the COP Summit in Glasgow at the end of the year. So we have a lot to look forward to. Our compliance report in full is available from our website, the G7 Information Center website at www.g7.utoronto.ca/compliance. And you can also download our background book, which contains several articles with performance assessments on the subjects on the G7 agenda, as well as articles by Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, President Charles Michel of the European Union, Chancellor Angela Merkel, who will be attending her last summit at the G7 in Cornwall, as well as articles by the guest leaders, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, and who's the second one? Australia, Scott Morrison, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, and many, many more. That is also available from our website. So please visit us at www.g7.utoronto.ca. Thank you. And thanks everyone for participating.